I love Facebook, I love memes, and I love talking to new people. I even love long comment sections, etc. That being said, I never give any personal information, such as where I work or where I live. My birthday info is private, so on and so on. I've made quite a few friends that I don't know personally, but agree with or had really good discussions with. So after commenting back and forth on a friend's post for a while, it was no surprise to me when Tyler messaged me. It started off fairly simple. We just talked about the post we commented on, and common interests. I was excited to have a new friend. He seemed pretty interesting, and we had a lot in common. I'm not a beauty queen or anything, but I let him know after about an hour of casual conversation that I was taken happily. I enjoyed his friendship, but it wouldn't lead into anything more since I'm going to get married next year. He seemed a little upset, but respectful. I told him goodnight and went to sleep and thought nothing of it. The conversation continued for a few days. He started to get a little pushy if I didn't respond immediately, and I told him that I was busy, so I may not always answer right away. And then he apologized and told me that he was just bored and lonely. I started to put a little distance because he didn't really back down, but I didn't want to completely give up my new friendship because I hated the fact that he was so lonely. One day, he randomly messaged me saying that he wanted to have me in his arms. I immediately nipped at that, reminding him of my relationship, and telling him if he didn't stop, then our friendship would be done, because I respect and am loyal to my fiancé. He immediately lost his shit, messaging me saying he didn't care about my fiancé, and making threats towards him, etc. I stopped messaging and selected to put his messages on ignore. He could still message me, but it wouldn't go to my inbox. I made a post about it, and a friend of mine commented and said he had done the same thing to her, except he knew where she lived and would show up outside her house. I freaked out and I went to see if there were more messages from him. This is where the shitstorm really begins though. He messaged me over a dozen times, different things, started off kind of taunting me for not answering, then moved on to him messaging me about some asshole who cut him off or was driving too slow for his taste. Then to him saying he was going to shoot the guy and it would be my fault because I made him so angry by ignoring him. I messaged him telling him to leave me the hell alone, and I stopped replying for a while. He started messaging me and narrowing down on where I live. That really freaked me out, as I had never told him where I lived or anything even remotely close to my house. The only thing I had ever said was I'd talk to him later because I was going to Arby's to get some food, and my phone was dying. Yet he somehow knew I was 7 minutes from the Arby's by my house, exactly how long it takes to walk there for me. And there are several Arby's in my city. Then he started narrowing down to what street I lived off of, down to knowing a 4-door black sedan was linked to my address, which there was, but not in my name. It was in my sister's name when she registered it as an Uber. But that was enough for me, and I called a non-emergency line. The police refused to do anything, of course, saying until he actually showed up or did something, there was nothing they could do. Just never mind the fact that he was sending me pictures of dead people and saying that was going to be my family and was narrowing down my address. Unless he actually showed up, I was screwed. All I could do was apply for a protective order, so I did. Tyler kept messaging me, so I told him there was a PO in place, and he needed to leave me alone. He responded with, there was nothing that could be done until he was served and signed it, which is true. My fiancé is in IT, and he has a cousin who was pretty tech savvy as well, and managed to get the last couple of addresses Tyler had, but the police couldn't find him at either of those. We had license plate numbers, address, full name, birthday, etc., yet he seemed untraceable. He stopped for a while, but the day of my court case to have the PO extended to 2 years, he started again. My fiancé filed criminal charges for the threats he made. He said, someone could come shoot you in 15 minutes. His last known address was exactly a 15-minute drive from my house. I've spent the last couple of months completely afraid. He was arrested and served finally. I think he was speeding or something, and it turns out he has a history of this. Multiple charges, all dropped or dismissed. He's done it to a couple of my friends who showed up to my court case for the criminal charges. They dropped everything from felonies to a misdemeanor, disorderly conduct charge, with 12 months jail time, depending on his behavior, because they couldn't prove it was him and not someone else behind the keyboard. Especially with me never seeing his face IRL before the court date. Even though I had 2 people who had received messages from him, and seen him face to face as well. I can't sleep. The slightest noise wakes me up panicking. It's been hell for my family.
I almost got kidnapped in school. Growing up, I was always a shy and quiet kid. Because of that, it was hard for me to make friends in school or connect with other people in general. Whenever I faced difficulty, I chose to struggle alone instead of asking for help or being vocal about my needs. This timid nature of mine not only made me go through life struggling more than I should have, but also got me in dangerous situation. The incident happened when I was in 7th grade. It was a warm Friday afternoon in late May, and I was looking forward to the weekend. My cousin Taylor was coming over to spend a weekend, and we had plans to binge watch movies and play video games all weekend long. It was one of the things that had kept me going through the school day. Now to give you some context, I almost never walked alone from school. My parents were always cautious, and our neighborhood, although safe, had some areas they didn't fully trust. They insisted on picking me up every day. Usually it was my mom, but today my older brother Sam was supposed to get me. Every time someone came to get me, the school staff made sure to check the name and have them sign a logbook. It was strict, but my parents liked it that way. That afternoon, the bell rang, and I gathered my things, heading out to the front gate where the cars lined up. But as I looked around, my brother Sam had not yet arrived. I figured he was running late. I figured he was running so late. So I sat on a bench near the entrance and waited, watching as one by one kids left with their parents or on the bus. After a while, it was just me and a couple of teachers who were looking out for the weekend. I checked my phone, no messages. 45 minutes have gone by, and I was starting to feel anxious. I wanted to call my brother, but thinking he might be on the road and I didn't want to disturb him driving, I chose not to. Instead, I left him messages and stood up, deciding to head inside for safety. But as I walked towards the school's front office, I noticed a man I'd never seen before standing by the entrance. He was tall, wearing all black from tip to toe, and carrying a large leather bag. Our eyes met for a second, and something about the way he looked at me made my stomach turn. I quickly turned around and hurried into the office. There, I stood by the floor for another 10 minutes, then finally gathered my courage to explain my situation to the secretary, who listened with a bored expression. I gave her my brother's number, and she tried calling him, but no luck. Then I gave her my dad's number. Unfortunately, he picked it up. He sounded frustrated, saying Sam should have been there by now, and that he'd try to call him. Fortunately, he couldn't leave at work for another couple of hours. By then, it had been an hour since school let out, and the empty building made me feel uneasy. The secretary was clearly annoyed, and I felt guilty for keeping her waiting. Just then, I heard someone walk into the office. I looked over and froze. It was the same man, dressed in all black with a leather bag I'd seen outside. Only now he was wearing janitor's uniform. He started talking with the office lady. I remember this part clearly. The man eventually asked what she was still doing at the school, and she proceeded to explain our whole situation. The man looked at me and claimed he lived right next to my house and knew my parents. Then he offered me a ride home. I was caught off guard when he mentioned my dad's name. While I didn't know all of my dad's acquaintances, something in my gut told me the man was bluffing. At that point, 2 red flags were going off in my head. Firstly, if I've seen this guy entering the building only a few minutes ago, why would he already leave to go home? Second thing, I had never seen him around my neighborhood before. Even though he knew my dad, there's no guarantee they were friends, and trusting a stranger felt wrong. I was thinking the school would never let a random man take a kid home without prior notice. But then the office lady surprised me by saying it was a great idea. She didn't even bother to ask for the man's ID or anything. I could literally see the relief in her eyes, as she would no longer have to wait for my ride to show up. Not even 2 seconds later, the guy, before I could even say anything in response, grabbed my hand started practically dragging me towards the front door. I expected the office lady to say something, but when I glanced back at her, she was already gathering her things to go home. Looking back now, I wish I had yelled that I didn't know the man and insisted on waiting for my brother, but I didn't, and the man dragged me out of the office. But by some stroke of luck, as I was being pulled out the front door, I saw my brother's car pulling into the parking lot. I screamed that my brother was here, and the guy froze for a second. He shouted for my brother's name as he got closer. Then the suspicious man let go of me and began speed walking in the opposite direction. Apparently, the reason my brother was so late was due to a terrible traffic jam, and his phone had ran out of battery. So he couldn't receive any calls. When I got into the car with him, Sam immediately asked the guy who he was, who had been holding me. I explained everything, and he was understandably shocked. When we got home, he told the parents, and they quickly reported the situation to the school. Not long after, the office lady was fired, but I never saw the janitor again. I have a theory that he was never actually a real janitor for the school. Anyway, I was glad that my brother arrived in time, and the whole experience taught me a valuable lesson. I must speak up when something feels wrong. Mass shooting at my school. I never paid much attention in school, especially in English class. I would just stay in the classroom and sleep all the time. My old English teacher didn't seem to care occasionally. He might ask the classmate sitting next to me to wake up, but that was about it. However, when a new teacher, Mrs. Johnson, transferred in during the middle of the school of my sophomore year, I couldn't get away with that anymore. Mrs. Johnson was strict and would often call me to stand up and answer questions or read about them if she noticed I was drifting off. That's why sometimes I skip her class and went to the library to take a nap instead of staying in the classroom. 3 weeks after Miss Johnson took over her class, she began to notice my occasional absence and decided to keep me after class for talk during one of the rare times I actually showed up. I had just finished giving a half-hearted answer to one of her questions when a bell rang, signaling the end of the break between classes. Miss Johnson clearly wasn't finished speaking with me, but had to let me leave anyway. Before I could return to my seat to pack my bag, she gave me a warning with that a stern look. "I'll be keeping my eye from you now and kid." I nodded and muttered a quick reply, "I know," before heading to my class. Before I could take another step down the hallway, the school PA system crackled, and the principal's voice echoed through the speakers, sounding more tense than I ever heard. "Attention students and staff, please remain in your classroom. This is a lockdown. I repeat, this is a lockdown, not a drill. Teachers and students, get inside the classrooms and lock your doors immediately." The weight of those words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a drill. I was terrified at the thought that might be coming for me and for all of the people in my school, and this could be the last day we'd see our families and friends. With all the school shootings happening across America, that was the first thing that came to my mind. I immediately rushed back to Mrs. Johnson's class. Running alongside were a bunch of other kids who also piled at the same time as me. After we were all locked inside behind the door, we were instructed to hide in the back left corner. Behind the desk, we were not allowed to speak. 10 minutes went by and the classroom was dead silent, except for the rapid thudding of my own heartbeat. Another minute passed, then 2. The seconds stretched on, feeling like hours. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of a man screaming somewhere down the hall. The kind of scream that ripped through the silence, raw and desperate. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The room went ever quieter, if that was possible. No one moved. No one breathed. I locked eyes with Mrs. Johnson from across the room. The look in his eyes told me everything. We weren't safe. Whatever was happening outside the door, it was worse than any of us had imagined. Suddenly, we heard a loud banging, still coming from down the hall. The man's voice yelling that he was going to kill everyone there, and that he was armed with bombs and multiple guns. All of this was happening, and I was in disbelief. Next thing I knew, our door was being banged on, and the man started yelling someone's name, telling her that she needed to open up. He was sending threats, saying that if she didn't open the door by the time he finished counting, he was going to blow the door open and shoot the entire room down. Even though we were all terrified, we wouldn't risk opening the door. His threats were real, but if he was going to harm any of us, he'd have to get through that door himself. When we didn't respond, his anger escalated, and he had began pounding the hard of the door of the glass window, clearly trying to break it. Thankfully, we were huddled in the back left corner of the classroom. After a brief silence, bullets started ripping through the door, one after another. The glass shattered completely. He tried to reach through the broken window to unlock the door, but it was too high for him to reach. Thank the Lord for whoever designed the door. It's the reason my friends and classmates gotta keep believing. He just keep on yelling, saying we were all sinners and we had to pay for our sins. After a few minutes, he stopped for a second. We weren't sure if he was gone or not. A few more minutes after just waiting, we heard at least 5 more gunshots. It was the police. They shot and killed the man on the spot, and we were all safe now. The man that had been screaming earlier, we found it was in fact our librarian. The killer had murdered him with multiple gunshots. He had been in the bathroom when the lockdown started and tried to return to the library but never made it. What really concerns me after the mass shooting is how long it took for the police to arrive once the lockdown began. From what I've gathered and what my mom later found out, the shooter was a former student at my school. After a divorce, he killed his entire family, his ex-wife and 2 daughters, before coming to our school to continue his rampage. Our school security didn't carry guns, so there wasn't much that they could do when the police arrived. Looking back, it's still hard to believe this is happening. I personally went through. I feel horrible for the victim who lost his life, and for everyone who was close to him.